Hi, I'm Brooklyn and I am going to show you how to make our witch's feet table runner pattern. This is super fun, and if you've bought the pattern, then you have what you need to get started. This is how it looks when it's done. We love this, very festive, very fun. As you'll see, there's no paper piecing and no applique, so that makes a pattern super easy and fun to make. I will be linking another video in the description that shows how to make a snowball block and a half square triangle. Those are crucial foundational things for this video. So make sure to check those out if you're unfamiliar. If you have purchased the pre-cut kit, then you're ready to get started. If you have just the pattern, then you'll need to cut out your pieces before starting this video because we're just gonna jump right in. So if you need to do that, pause here and then come back and I'll meet you right here. This pattern is modified to make the pillow instead of the table runner. So I'm gonna show you how to do the math to get the borders and everything. I did mess up a little bit, so I'll show you how to fix that as well as how to not make the same mistake that I did. We will be starting on page 2. Make sure you pay attention for quantities and everything else that you're gonna need, but I'm gonna show you how to assemble the boots. If you see in the top corner of the frame, it'll show you kind of where I'm at in the pattern, and that might help you with some of your questions. But if you do have questions, please put them in the comments. I check that every day, so we'll make sure that we get it answered. So let's get started. So for these, I am just doing the snowball corner that is instructed in the pattern. If you are unfamiliar with making snowball corners, go check out the tutorial video that's linked in the description where I go in depth on how to make these. For this one over here, I am doing a double corner. So when you're making the double corner, as I show in the video, you do one, we'll open it up, trim off that back, and then sew another one up here at the top. Chain piecing is just so fun because it's like its own little decoration almost, but it's part of your quilt. Plus it makes it so much faster. We also have a tutorial on chain piecing, and this wasn't quite the same as what that tutorial shows because these are just little pieces, but that one shows how to do entire blocks with chain piecing. So once all these pieces are sewn like this, then you will have to square up the blocks, and some of them look great. Like this one, she's looking pretty good. But then you have other ones inevitably that are gonna be more like this. And as small as that is, that can mess up how your quilt turns out. So even though this isn't 100% necessary of a step, I always recommend squaring blocks because it makes the finished result so much better if you do. So I am lining up my block here. I have this main one that started as a 2.5 inch square, so it should still be 2.5 inches. But then we have this piece that we attached that got a little crazy. I'm just gonna trim off that corner so that I am left with a pure 2.5 inch square. Now you can see that's a lot neater than it was when it had the little thing sticking out the top. So I'm going to do that with all of these, and I'm also going to do it with the one that we made that's for this piece here. This goes in between the two boots that you make, and so it's going to have 2 of these, but you start off by doing just one corner at a time. On these, I press the seams towards the gray fabric, and that'll help it hide, but on this, I don't want to press the seams towards the background because it's going to like show through the front. So we are going to press this seam towards the gray. And maybe it's just me, but I feel like half of the blocks that I make like this turn out really funky. So that's why I like to square them up. And then because this is the one that's the double, we're going to put the other one on here too. So now you'll need to square up all of these little pieces, and we'll come back here to make the next step. Even if it may not look like there's much to trim off, I'm always going to check and make sure. After you've made your snowball corners, you should have 2 that are the boot fabric and your background fabric, and you should have 4 that are the boot and the sock or stocking color. You should also have this one piece that has 1 background of the big square and then 2 of the little dog ears here at the top. I'm going to take these and set them off to the side while we make the next blocks, which are half square triangles. You need 3 half square triangles per shoe, and so since it makes 2 at a time, you need 3 of each square. And this is another one that we have a full tutorial on, so I'm not going to go in depth on how to make this, and I'm just going to make them really fast. So now that you have your pieces here, you are ready to start actually piecing the boots. So we have our little rectangles, and this one isn't going to come into play yet because it's the background. But these two are what we're going to use now. So I'm going to lay out one whole boot so you can kind of see what we're doing here. I put the color at the top and then the black next and color black. And then we are going to put these pieces with the purple on the top corner together down here. If you want to switch these around, I mean, you totally can, right? But I like the look of it having the purple peeking out the bottom. It kind of makes it feel more of a fancy boot. And you might look at this and say, oh no, those are much bigger. But remember, we have a seam allowance here. So once we have put the seam allowance in, that will be the same size as these rectangles. And then we'll be able to sew that together. You are going to make a left boot and a right boot. So when you make these, you have your little diagram here. You make your left one, but then you'll also make the mirror image. And that can be kind of confusing. So let's look at how to do that. So we have our 2 squares here, and then we take 2 more squares of the boot fabric. And these are just plain squares. These are just part of the boot. And then we have a half square triangle that is half boot fabric, half background. And we are gonna place that here. And then our other one is a snowball corner with background fabric and boot fabric. And we are gonna place that here. So this is your left boot, and this heel right here is your biggest indicator. So when you're looking at this diagram, it might be kind of hard to get how that lays out, but just remember that you have your big one and your small one here, and they are the same direction. When you're doing the other side, it's the same thing, just facing the opposite direction. Then I switched back here so that we're making the left one first, just so it matches this and we can all be on the same page here. I'm gonna take these pieces and sew them together along this seam down the center. So when you're matching up these snowball corner pieces, I don't know why, but for me, these always get a little crazy. So if you have tips on how to make sure that this corner is always the exact same size on your blocks, please comment. Please help me know so I can learn how to do that better. But if you are at least squaring your blocks, they'll be close enough. And these ones actually look pretty good. So that when I open, I want this seam to make a perfect triangle. And pursuing perfection is always pointless, especially in quilting, because this is something that is, handmade, and perfect doesn't really exist, but we're gonna try. So I've lined that up as well as I can and making sure my corners are lined up. And I'm also put this pin right here so that I could make sure that this seam hits in the right spot. And these two are a lot less temperamental because they're just squares. And then we have our little heel here. And like I showed before, the background arrows that it makes should be pointing the same direction. I'm gonna place them over the top and sew them down. So let's see how we did here. Perfect, as we expected, right, on that one. And then we actually have a pretty good setup here. This seam looks really clean. So I like it, I'm gonna accept it, and I'll use it in my piecing. If it looks crazy, feel free to unpick it, but if not, don't worry about it. It's still gonna look really cute when it's done. On these, I like to press the seam open just because for the picture look of the quilt, pressing the seam open is going to be the best way to eliminate any sort of variance in the shape. Like it'll keep it really clean when you press these seams open. Except for this one, we want to press towards the dark fabric. So here's how they look from the back. I love when the little triangle shapes invert like that. I don't know what it is about that, but I love it. So we have all of our little pieces here, and then here's our heel. You may have noticed that I'm using a really dark thread for piecing this. And I've learned a lot about thread colors doing machine quilting for other people, because if you are piecing a quilt, no matter who you are or how well you do, when you have this quilted, you're going to pull on the fabric. And sometimes the thread will show and there's nothing you can do to fix it. So if I pieced this in a neon green thread and I pulled this, you'd see neon green throughout. And let me tell you what, that is so sad when you have a beautiful quilt and then this wild color of thread is just showing through and you can't do anything to fix it. So make sure you're piecing in a color that coordinates with your quilt. I, on this one, opted for the dark because there are so many pieces that are pretty dark in this, but also if you see dark thread between the background pieces, it'll just look like a dot. Like it won't look like anything crazy. So pick your coordinating thread based on what is the most prominent thing in your quilt. Now I'm going to sew these rectangles together all the way down throughout this thing. Now on this one, I noticed that I still have some overhang here on this piece, which is kind of interesting because these all started as the same size and now they're not. So I'm gonna take this down here to my mat and I'm measuring how big this is. And I can see that somehow this little edge is too big for the rest of the blocks. This should be a 4.5-inch square at this point. And over here, it's just a little bit past that. So to make sure that she's looking clean once we're done, I'm gonna just trim that off so I don't have to worry about it. And then I'll get back to sewing these together. It's kind of fun if you sew these together first in your little chain. Then you can pick up this piece and sew it on, and then you'll have your top and bottom section of the boot done, as we see over here in this diagram. And I am going to sew from the back here so that I can watch and make sure that this cross is where my next seam hits, because that way I'll know that I'm not losing any corners and it'll hit in the right spot. And there you have your column shown on diagram 6. This is all, well, we need to press it, but then it's all ready to go to add the next little piece on. So we're gonna need these pieces. I'm making this shape here. So I have 2 background rectangles. I have one of these half square triangles, another one down here that makes this little flying geese shape here. I don't know, I never know if we should call that a flying goose or flying geese, but we'll go with flying geese. And then just a plain square down here. Now in this one, we had 7 sections. These rectangles essentially count as 2 sections on this way because they're just faced the other way. So you can make sure you have this right if you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 sections, and that will match the boot. So let's sew this together. Now we have our left boot almost done. I'm going to press these seams and sew the strand together. Now the pattern I use for pressing these seams is kind of crazy, and these differences are pretty subtle, but they can help a ton in the long run. So these seams up here, I pressed open. This one is pressed towards the black, open, and then pressed again up towards the dark fabric. And the reason I do all of these crazy different pressing things is because I want to make sure that the picture that I'm making looks the way I want it to. And actually, I did this one the wrong way. I need to press this black down to this. So that tiny subtle difference is about as 3D as we're going to be able to get on a quilt like this. Maybe some people are fancy out there and actually make 3D quilts, but that's not me. So when you press the seam this way, where the sock is kind of going under the boot, when the seam is going that way, it lifts this up right here, so that this boot looks like it's over the top of the sock, which is how it would be in real life. And those little things honestly probably don't matter a ton, but when you look at the finished quilt, it gives like a different little edge to it, and it can be really fun to see how that impacts it when you're done. So now I am going to pin this in place because I want to make sure that all of my ends line up in the right spot. And you can use this as I was showing you the 7 sections. So here's 1 section or 2 sections, and I'm just stopping and pinning where there's a seam. So this looks like this white background fabric is just slightly longer than what this purple and black made together. So by pinning it here, I can use that to know how much to ease that fabric in, and then I will have my seams matching in the right spot. So then I can do that again down here and all the way across all of these different things. And this is the only corner or the only point that I have to hit. So I'm going to sew with this shorter side facing up. So not this way, but this way. All right, now this is really starting to come together. I'm gonna press all of this seam open. This whole seam is just gonna be pressed open. I'm gonna make the second boot. Remember to make sure that this is a mirror. So these pieces here are gonna be what's different. They'll be flipped. And then we'll come back and sew this center piece together. Now that we have our boot shapes, and we did indeed mirror them because that's an easy thing to mix up, we're gonna make this center column before we make any of the toes. This toe piece goes in the next section. So this center column is done with 2 of these rectangles, your piece with the double snowball corner, and then a 3rd rectangle down here at the bottom. Then let's make sure while we're sewing this one that we go through that point right here so that your corners match the right way. Then we will press all of these seams open. Now we take this piece and sew it in between both of these boot sections. Now once we have that done, press these seams open and the main part of your boot block is done. Now that we've sewn this whole boot section together, you can tell that it's missing something here on the toes. When you are doing the table runner, you will be nesting the boots together. So you sew this weird little funky column thing to make the boots nest. But since we are making this into a pillow, we aren't going to need to do that nesting step. So you take your toe piece here and the background fabric points away from the rest of the boot. And then you will need either 3 of these rectangles or a strip that's the same length as this. I'm using the rectangles because that's what I have cut, and it's just easier on my brain to not figure out how long to make the strip. So now we have 1 toe piece, and we're gonna do the same on the other side. So when you're nesting these for the table runner, you're gonna place these with opposite ends, and then it will match down here. So this would be the toe for your next boot section that's facing upside down. Pressing the seams on this piece doesn't matter very much because it's just white on white. So as long as this one is pressed down towards the toe piece, it doesn't matter. So now I have my witch's boot piece all made right here. We'll come back to that in a minute. But I have this cute little pillow that I've made, and I kind of cycle it through for the seasons. I don't have the pattern from this. I bought this from a store on Etsy, and I can link the pattern here. It was really fun to make, but honestly, I'm not really into paper piecing. It's a lot of work. So we are gonna change my little pillow and put on the witch's feet. So I have my insert. Now inserts can come in so many different sizes. I honestly don't remember how big this one is. So I took it out so I could measure, and I just pull the fabric apart right here like this and pull it tight against my mat so I can measure how big it is. This is an 18-inch pillow insert. Now my witch's boots piece right here looks like she finished off to 18 inches wide and just about 14 inches tall. Barely under 14 inches, but we'll go with 14. You know what, we'll actually go ahead and trim off that bottom so I can make sure it is at 14 inches. Okay, now that everything's square, we can start adding the borders to give this an 18-inch. To make this 18 inches so that it fits on my pillow. And if you are someone who wanted the socks to go up all the way to the top, you could add another strip of black here and then fill in your background pieces and then just do a little bit more. But I'm a fan of how this looks. I like the 4 pieces, so we'll just go with that. And this background fabric actually came from my stash, so I have all these random shapes that we're gonna cut the border from. If we have this at 14 inches by 18 inches, and accounting for what you need on the pillow is a 1/2 inch seam allowance, we are going to need to add just 1 inch to each side, which is a small piece. Maybe that's a little annoying, but it's important. So we'll add the cute little inch to the side. So here's everyone's favorite part. I'm going to show you how to do some quick quilting math. How is that not 19 inches? What did I just do? So here's my boot block. I have this at 14 by 18. So 14 inches tall, 18 inches wide. And if this part makes you sick and you don't want to do math anymore because you're done with that phase of your life, that's fine. Skip ahead to when I tell you the actual dimensions. But in case your boot came out to a different size, then this is going to be helpful. So somehow I got to this point and my piece isn't 19 inches. And I'm realizing that I did my math wrong, and this is at 21 inches, not 19 and a half. So maybe disregard my quilt math section, because who actually knows how to do that? Apparently not me. So I'm going to trim this down to 19 inches, which makes this side border very small. But if we didn't add it, then it would be too small to quilt with. So all is well. So that would be, if I have it folded in half, so I make sure I'm trimming the same amount off of each side. If I have it to here, that would be 18. This would be 19 inches. It's always better to trim than to add tiny pieces to fix your mistake. So we're all okay, everything's fine. And this little tiny piece is basically gonna just be tucked in the seam allowance when you sew your pillow. But like I said, if you didn't have it, then it wouldn't be big enough. So after pressing, we now have our pillow top done, which is very exciting. It's gonna be so cute. I don't know what I'm gonna do for the back yet, but it's gonna be something fun. Go check out the next video in this series where I'm gonna show you how we will quilt spider webs on top of this.